Wretched Radio begins in 3, 2, 1.
So are you suggesting to me that heaven is actually a place?
Yes, sir.
Where is that place?
We don't know where it is exactly right now.
Then why would you ask a question, where do I go?
Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth. No pie in the sky when you die by and by.
That is a mischaracterization of the Christian gospel that fits the social agenda, which gets all caught up in this world and fails to understand that we are to set our affections not on this world, but on the world to come.
It's time for Wretched Radio with Todd Friel.
Uh-oh.
Let's go talk about the book we all read.
Books, you know they're dangerous. Take a look, it's in a book.
This is Wretched Radio. You know you're in for choppy waters when you have to give a disclaimer to parents about the subject matter that is going to be discussed in this Tim Challies book review with Tim Challies.
Huh?
A book that, yeah, I know, something different for us, written by an evangelical pastor. Mom and Dad, this will not be profane. This will be delivered very sensitively, but this is indeed mature content. Joining us to discuss what is bound to be one of the, if not the most talked about evangelical book of the year. It's called Real Marriage, written by the, well, continuing to be somewhat controversial Pastor Mark Driscoll of the Acts 29 Network. He also has a very big church in Seattle, planting churches all over the country. He is an author, and he is a provocateur. He is young, he is restless, he is reformed, and his new book is called Real Marriage, and it is, well, let's let Tim Challies explain what it is. Mr. Challies, thank you very much for being with us today, sir.
Hey, good to talk to you again, Todd.
All right, Tim, you and your reviews of this book, which is indeed a zinger, were very sensitive, and we will keep that same tone here for Mom and Dad and for the kids' sake. Which really brings me to my first question for you, because you read his book twice and you have reviewed it at Challies.com. This book deals partly with marriage, partly with intimacy within the context of marriage. In your opinion, Tim, should this be a conversation that is had in a public forum like books, internet, perhaps even a church service about the specific details of the intimate married life?
Yeah, well, that's the question, isn't it? I think that's the question a lot of people are asking and trying to grapple with after this book and with many other similar books is what is appropriate to discuss in the context of local church or in the public wider context. We really need evangelical Dr. Ruth, right, who will sit there and answer our deepest questions in a public forum. And, yeah, I don't think we do. I don't think
I think the reason that if somebody's scratching their head and going, well, why is that important? You need to understand, and again, we will deal with this sensitively, this book gets into detail about intimate acts, quite honestly, Tim, I haven't referred to since public junior high. It is, no, it's not salacious. I think we would agree on that. But it is very forthright with its discussion about issues, specific acts that can or can't or should or shouldn't be done in the context of marriage. And so, historically, I think, Tim, if we look at it this way, and I think this is important for us to ponder, if this book had been written 15 years ago, what would have the response been of the evangelical community? Or, perhaps phrased another way, can you imagine Martin Lloyd-Jones writing a book like this?
To ask the question is to answer it, right? It's just completely absurd, which, okay, doesn't necessarily make it sinful, but it does make you wonder, right? If a whole generation of people would say this book is wildly inappropriate, that should at least inform us as we think about it. And certainly this book, if it had been written 10 or 15 years ago, at best it would have been a behind-the-counter kind of book in a Christian bookstore. It certainly wouldn't have been handed out in churches and made public. But that's part of the discussion that Driscoll broaches right at the beginning, is he's saying we live in a very, very sexually open culture. We've got this discussion raging all around us, so Christians need to be leading that discussion and involved in that discussion. Therefore, we need to have this level of frank conversation in order to meet the frank conversation in the wider culture.
I'm not sure that justifies it. I know that explains
agree.
it, but I don't know that that actually is a justification for a public conversation about acts like this. Tim, you reviewed the book chapter by chapter, and what I would like for you to do, first of all, because I think people will find very interesting. You actually had a critique about this book that kind of went beyond the content. You talked about in the beginning that this is just not a well-written book. Why did you say that?
Yeah, I kind of hate to say that. Occasionally I do come across a book that's been professionally published, but it is just lacking professionalism. This was an example of that, where it just seemed like it was very hastily thrown together. And honestly, it felt like marriage seminars that had been sort of crammed into the book form. And then there were a lot of just editorial issues that should have been taken care of. So I just found it frustrating to read even on that level. It just wasn't carefully put together. It just seemed to have come together far too quickly.
Sloppy, question marks where there should be periods or vice versa, footnotes that didn't exist, promises of content to come that was not delivered. So
yeah, and interestingly, one of those footnotes is a footnote to an interview in an adult magazine. They're quoting an interview that was given to an adult magazine. If you follow the footnote for it, the footnote leads to nowhere. And so you wonder, where did that reference from an adult magazine come from?
Now, some people in the Christian community are praising the book in this sense, that it is refreshing that a pastor and his wife would talk so transparently about their intimate life, the struggles that they have had, and the, if you will, victories that they've now had in that arena. In your opinion, is that transparency a good thing?
I think there's a time for some transparency, even maybe progressing to transparency about a sexual relationship, but I think it has to be done in a very careful context, in a very personal context, so not in a book, but talking to maybe people in your local church who are struggling with something, and you can say, well, we've struggled too, and here's how we resolved it. I think that's a very, very different thing from writing a book that's inviting the whole world into the intimate relationship between a husband and a wife. That's a very, it honestly felt, as I was reading the book, I felt voyeuristic. I felt like I was looking on something that I had no business looking on. I really felt, I felt the weight of that. I didn't want to be reading these things.
Yeah, they do put a disclaimer, Pastor Mark Driscoll and his wife, hey, don't read this book so you can understand what goes on behind our bedroom door. But the reality is, we do have to read about that.
Right, and they don't discuss the specifics of the things they do within their intimate relationship, so it doesn't go to that level. But it still just feels like too much information for someone who doesn't know them, for somebody who isn't in their context.
Well, I would say this, however, what was revealed about his wife, I'm gonna direct any criticisms that I have at Mark. He's the man. He's a complementarian. That's one benefit of the book. He's a complementarian, and so is his wife. So I'm going to direct my critiques at him. Sir, what are you doing sharing such private details about your wife's sex life?
Mm-hmm.
That, to me, was not a manly thing to do.
No, I agree entirely. And again, there may be contexts in which that information can be helpful to people, but largely there's so much that can be shared one-on-one or from one woman to another woman who are grappling with very similar issues. But to put it in a book, and especially a book that's being sold and marketed as a provocative book, it just makes it all a show. It feels like we're opening up our lives like a reality show just to invite you in so you can be entertained almost by all that's happened to us. It really felt, again, voyeuristic in that way.
Tim, what was the name of the website? I'd sent you an email about it. You had talked about it on your site. They help people deal with addictions, whether it's sexual, alcohol, drugs, etc. Set Free, what was it called?
Setting Captives Free.
Setting Captives Free. Okay. We're researching it because it looks like we might have a good resource, but we haven't done our research yet. But I bring it up, Tim, because I was fascinated. The fellow who heads up this ministry to help people with their addictions, gambling, sexual, whatever it happens to be, he gave a bit of his own testimony on the front page, and he said, having struggled with addictions for decades, something like that, God saved him, set him free, and he no longer has found himself in any of those lifestyle patterns of sinfulness. Now, I got the point. I don't know what is. It could have been gambling. It could have been smoking. I don't know what the deal was. I didn't hear the details, and I didn't need to. I got the point. I think the Driscolls failed to make the point without revealing all of those details.
Right, that's absolutely true. There's just far too much detail given, and I hope we start to see a pushback now of people saying, okay, that's as far as we're ever going to let anything go. We need to now try and understand, where can we go? What is that? How much information can we give before it just tips over into the voyeuristic or exhibitionist or salacious or whatever?
I don't know if you agree with me, Tim. I think this book goes way past that line.
I agree. I understand people are looking for specific answers to specific questions, but I don't think the best way to address those questions is just plain to answer them, to give a yes or no. I think the better way to answer them is to give the underlying gospel information, to help people understand the gospel, and then to let them work out the implications of that. And often then you don't need to come to an answer of, can I do this or that? Well, let's explain the gospel, and then the question will answer itself.
Now that is the bullseye when it comes to the critique of this book. Mm-hmm. If we had to pick the big problem with this book, would we agree that it is the lack of gospel foundation?
Right. Well, I think there's lots of gospel in parts of the book, but when you get to that final chapter, so when people are critiquing the book, there's this chapter 10 that essentially asks the can we questions within marital intimacy. Can we do this? And there's this long list of very specific acts. And when it comes down to those questions, that's where the gospel suddenly goes missing. It's not there. So when you're working out the deepest implications of the gospel, well, the gospel goes, and instead they introduce this grid of what is essentially law. Does God forbid it? No, then I can do it. But of course, the gospel tells us we don't need to be forbidden from doing something in order to say, no, that's not wise, that's not loving, that's not right, that's not God's design.
I think.
And so the gospel has to work itself out in the marriage relationship in that way.
Now, I think it was one very clever reviewer who said something, and maybe you can help me with this, Tim, said something like, instead of asking all these law questions, what can we do, what can't we do, those are law questions. What is the gospel now? How should I behave in light of the gospel? Do you remember what reviewer said that?
I do not, no. I don't. But that is essentially the question that made in the One at Gospel Coalition. How do I behave on the basis of the gospel? So the gospel tells me that my marriage is supposed to reflect Christ's love for the church. And I'm asking a can we question. I just need to say, well, is this the kind of action Christ would take on behalf of his people? Does this accord with that? And in many cases you say, no, of course it doesn't. That's not a loving action. That's not a selfless action. That's an action that goes immediately opposed to the gospel.
All right, then, in case somebody has not ever heard a sermon, first of all, would you agree a pastor can talk about intimacy from the pulpit?
Absolutely, he can.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so if somebody has never heard this and they're maybe pondering exactly what it is that you're saying, Tim, how does the gospel inform activities in the marriage bed? How do I take the gospel? Okay, I understand the gospel. Jesus died for me. He rescued me from the pit. Now that is going to inform my behavior and my activities with my spouse. Mm-hmm. Can you tussle that out for us a little bit?
Sure. Well, I think in terms of discussing intimacy, we recently in our church we preached through Hebrews, and there's let the marriage bed be undefiled, right? And the word is essentially coitus. Like it's pretty obvious what it's talking about. So if a pastor is going to preach the Bible through the text, he has to speak about intimacy in marriage, right? So yes, we have the ability to talk about it, but it's interesting how when the Bible describes marital intimacy, it never gets salacious. There's parts of the Bible where things are discussed that are very intimate, but they're always in bad context, right? It's somebody being defiled or something like that. But when it comes to the marriage bed, when it comes to the intimate relationship in marriage, it's always very subtle and very dignified. And really that's a lot of what's being lost. Look at Song of Solomon. It is so dignified and so subtle. It's obvious what's happening, but it's very poetic and again, dignified.
It's shielded. It is not a license to, okay, now you can go talk about intimacy in graphic terms, because Song of Solomon is not written in shocking graphic terms, no matter how much people try to make it say that.
Right.
It's designed to be sensitive ears can hear it because they don't even really know what it says. That's what poetry does.
Right, and it conveys a feeling, it conveys the emotion, it conveys freedom, it conveys intimacy, but it doesn't convey explicit actions. And so you're asking, how does the gospel apply to marriage? Well, we know that there's this relationship between gospel and marriage, right, where marriage is to be a display of the gospel. So right away you're on such strong footing there, just saying, I need to understand the gospel, and then I need to just see how I can model the gospel in my relationship. As I said before, Christ would behave toward the church in this way, so I need to behave toward my wife in this way.
And that really should answer a lot of the can we do this questions. All right, we've only got about a half a minute left. One of the things,
let me say this, Todd.
Yeah.
I think this is important.
Yeah.
When you understand the gospel, you know that your needs, your deepest needs, have been met in Christ. So there's no need, nothing that you need that has been unfulfilled. So when you ask those can we questions, you're always coming from a position of strength. My needs have been met in Jesus Christ.
And that alters the answer to it also. Yeah, because that's one of the things that is brought out, I think Mark brings out in the book, and that is, hey, guys need this. No. We don't need it. We may desire it, and it can even be a healthy desire, but we don't need it because our needs have been met. All right, read the whole review. It is worth it at Challies.com, as always. Wow, a Tim Challies book review with Tim Challies. Carry on, Canadian.
Thank you.
All right. We will continue. There are others who are chiming in on the book, perhaps, of the year, next on Wretched Radio.
You've been listening to an edited version of Wretched Radio. If you'd like to hear the daily 2-hour broadcast and watch Todd sweat as he does the daily radio show and watch Wretched TV, plus a bunch of other cool stuff, visit wretchedradio.com.